Earlier this week, the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, voted to dissolve itself. New elections will be held March 17, 2015. Ostensibly, the reason for the premature dissolution was the so-called Jewish State Bill. And to help us understand the reasoning behind that, in Jerusalem, Israel, via Skype, here's Gershom Gorenberg, historian and journalist. He writes for the American Prospect and is the author of The Unmaking of Israel. Mr. Gorenberg, good to have you on TVO tonight. I wonder if we could just start by talking about the timing of this. Why did the Israeli Prime Minister decide that now was a good time to introduce the so-called Jewish State Bill?
Well, he's been pushing this bill basically since last spring, when, after the negotiations broke down with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. I don't think that there was some master political calculation behind the timing now. In fact, in my view, the fact that the coalition had lasted this long was what was surprising in view of the results of the 2013 elections.
Why, in your view, do you think this so-called Jewish state law is so controversial?
Well, the law is introduced as part of, if you listen to the statements of Netanyahu and of the authors of the law, what becomes clear is that, strangely enough, in the view of people like myself and the view of most of the Israeli left and center, they feel themselves to be terribly on the defensive, particularly because of a process that's gone on over the last 20 years of greater democratization within Israel itself. I'm not talking here about the occupied territories. I'm talking about Israel within the 1967 boundaries. In 1992, the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, passed what was basically a Bill of Rights. Following that, the Israeli Supreme Court asserted its power to overturn laws that violated that Bill of Rights. And a series of political and judicial battles since then have taken place in which a rather hesitant and middle-of-the-road court has sometimes taken action to expand equality and human rights within Israel. The political right, which has become more radicalized over the last few years, sees that as a threat and was trying to introduce a law of constitutional weight that would essentially protect existing forms of discrimination against the kind of judicial challenges that have taken place over recent years.
In which case, how strong among Jewish Israelis do you think the support for this bill is?
Well, I can't tell you that. And I can't tell you that for a couple of reasons. First of all, because I don't know all Jewish Israelis. No, I mean, the Jewish Israelis are no more monolithic in their views than the citizens of other countries. And in fact, I think one of the qualities of Israel as a Jewish state is a particularly high level of disagreement on most political issues. The second reason is that that political polling in Israel is inherently unreliable for another number of reasons. And the third thing is that even when the election that was set off by this crisis takes place, it will be fought on more issues and more personalities than simply this bill. So trying to tell you, 47% are against it and 53 are for it or vice versa would be very difficult. What I can say is that it was a breaking point for a government which included two centrist parties that, when push came to shove, saw this bill as a threat to the basic democratic principles of the State of Israel, and right-wing parties which were insistent on passing this bill. And that's where the government crumbled.
Okay, if you can't tell me how millions of Jewish Israelis feel about this, how about telling me how one Jewish Israeli feels about it, namely you? If I've got this right, I've seen you describe yourself as a left-wing, skeptical, Orthodox Zionist Jew. So if I've got that right, can you tell me how important Israel's Jewishness is to you personally?
Well, I'd like to separate two things. The question of Israel's Jewishness and the question of this law. I see the law in the various forms that it has been proposed to be a threat to Israel's democratic nature, and in my view, that's also a threat to Israel's Jewish character, because as I see it, for Israel to be a Jewish state, it necessarily has to be a democratic state. It necessarily has to protect the rights and the equality of non-Jews. It has to protect the right of, for instance, asylum seekers who come here. One of the things that upset the government is that the Supreme Court has twice struck down laws supported by the government that were aimed against the rights of asylum seekers. In my view, this bill is both anti-democratic and essentially anti-Jewish. But that brings me to a wider question which comes out of what you've raised. For me, the important aspect of Israel as a Jewish state is that this is a place where Jews have political agency as the majority, and where the majority culture, the invisible culture because it is the culture of the majority, is Jewish. As part of that culture, there is a constant argument about what Jewish means and what it obligates us to do and how that political agency should be expressed. In the political atmosphere at the moment, interestingly enough, we can see, at least at this moment, I can't tell you what will happen tomorrow, some effort on the left and center to unite forces against Netanyahu, to create a stronger political bloc opposing him, and a great deal of division and dissatisfaction on the right. So I would be the last person in the world to predict to you how that will play out between now and March 17th. Only a very poor bookmaker would try to make book on an Israeli election. And as I said before, Israeli polls have some built-in unreliabilities. But I do think that by framing the issue in that way, the crisis has galvanized those forces on the Israeli center and left who want to protect Israeli democracy.
Well, if you get your way, one of the leaders presumably who will have to champion that is the leader of the Labour Party, Isaac Herzog, who has said that the upcoming election is about extremism versus Zionism. And I wonder if you could help us understand how you see Jewish extremism in Israel as being a threat to the Zionist enterprise.
Well, first of all, I want to say as a philosophical point, Zionism isn't one idea, it's a family of ideas. The position that Netanyahu and his allies on the right have taken is a threat to a humanistic view of Zionism in which we have already created a state with a Jewish majority. We have accomplished the essential goal of Zionism, and our purpose looking forward is to function as a democratic state and protect those principles. The right is harming that in a number of ways. First of all, its continuing intention to hold on to the occupied territories undermines the basic principle of democracy, because we rule over a large number of people who are not part of the governing process, the Palestinians of the occupied territories. Second of all, with the assault on democratic principles, the government has acted as an enabler to Israel's most bitter critics abroad, has harmed support for Israel, has deeply damaged Israel's alliance with the United States, and in each of those ways has threatened Israel's future.
Michael Oren, the former Israeli ambassador to the United States, had this to say after the war in Gaza. He said, "Perhaps revulsion towards Zionism stems from its unusual blend of national identity, religion, and loyalty to a land. Japan offers the closest parallel, but despite its rapacious past, Japanese nationalism doesn't evoke the abhorrence aroused by Zionism." And I guess the question coming out of that is, do Israelis, do you think, want to be like Japan insofar as, never mind the enormous price they paid for their nationalism, but in terms of being racially homogeneous? Do you think Jewish Israelis want that kind of state? I'm
going to say to you again, there is no such thing as what Jewish Israelis want. This is a country politically divided in a very deep way. I do not think that a position of somehow or another Israel has to be homogeneous ethnically, or to use a more extreme word, racially. I do not think that that is something which is a majority position here. I don't even think that it's a position which is necessarily shared on the right. Israel's recently elected president, Reuven Rivlin, has been a bitter opponent, for instance, of the Jewish nation-state law and an advocate of equal rights for the Arab minority. I would say beyond that, that the attempt to make comparisons, to equate the Israeli situation with somebody else's situation, is inevitably one that leads to misunderstanding rather than understanding. I would say, in a Tolstoyan sense, every unhappy country is unhappy in its own way. So rather than trying to find whether Israel is the same as Japan or whether it's the same as South Africa, or maybe it's the same as the United States with its racial conflicts, it makes more sense to try to understand what Israel is.
Okay, that's fair enough. And just so you know, I'm not trying to make trouble here. When I say do Israelis think, it's kind of a short form of saying, do you think the largest plurality or the biggest chunk of Israelis believe? That's all I'm trying to find out. But having said that, let me try...
the idea of a homogeneous Israel is, if you really meant that, if you meant an Israel without non-Jews, that's the position of the most extreme edge of the radical right. The position of an Israel which, in which the unfortunate vision in which part of what Israel does is protect the rights of Jews, sometimes at the cost of non-Jews, has unfortunately become more prevalent on the Israeli right. One of the processes which has taken place over recent years is that in the largest right-wing party in Israel, the Likud, moderate, more democratic figures have been pushed out and more extreme figures have taken their place. That's what we saw in the primaries for the Likud ticket before the 2013 elections, and that is something which may well happen in the run-up to these elections as well.
Okay, let's finish up on this then. As we try to imagine what the future of Israel will look like, we have on this program, for example, talked to George Bisharat, who's a Palestinian-American law professor, who said, oh, Palestinian-Israeli solution? Sure, 30 years away at the very least. Naftali Bennett, the Jewish Home Party, rather right-wing party in Israel, said probably 20 years away.
No. Rather is an extreme understatement.
Okay. How would you prefer to characterize it?
Bennett's party is a party of the radical right.
Radical right. Okay. Having said that, if those prognostications turn out to be true, that we're decades away from some kind of rapprochement in that part of the world, do you think the two-state solution will still be viable then?
Well, first of all, since we're talking about the fate of a Jewish state, I'd like to cite a saying from a Jewish text that's nearly 2,000 years old. The Talmud says that when the temple was destroyed, prophecy was taken from the prophets and given to fools and children. The color of my beard rules me out as a member of one of those groups, and I do not intend to belong to the other group. So I am not going to make any prophecies for you all. I will cite what the longtime Israeli peacenik Uri Avneri has pointed out, which is that a week before, or certainly a year before the Berlin Wall fell, most Germans would have thought that that wouldn't happen for many years to come. I don't know anybody who predicted the fall of the collapse of the Soviet Union when it came about. And if Europe and the Soviet Union are areas of unpredictability, they look like the islands of stability compared to Israel and to the Middle East. So I think making predictions about what's going to happen in 20 years or 30 years, yeah, I put that in the category of being foolish. Is the two-state solution viable at the moment? The two-state, first of all, a mentor of mine once said, in politics, don't talk about solutions, talk about arrangements, better and worse arrangements. the best of the bad arrangements possible, to refer to the movie Argo. The best bad plan we have is still a two-state arrangement between Israelis and Palestinians. As we wait to implement it, the cost of implementation rises, but the cost is still much lower than all of the other bad plans that have been suggested from time to time.
Understood. Gershom Gorenberg, it's really good of you to join us on TVO tonight. I love it when guests push back a bit, and you did that, and we enjoyed it. Take good care.
My pleasure.
Toda rabba, litraot.
Gam lecha.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.